Imagine you are standing at the edge of the world's largest crowd. It is the morning of February 1st, 1979. The air in Tehran is cold and gray and electric. 5 million people, some say more, have poured into the streets from every direction the city has. They are pressed together so tightly that if you faint, you don't fall. The noise is unlike anything you have ever heard. It is not cheering exactly. It is something older than cheering. It is a sound you make when you have been waiting for something your whole life, and it is finally, after everything, here. A single Air France Boeing 747 breaks through the clouds and descends toward Mehrabad Airport. On board, one old man, 76 years old. Dark turban, white beard, eyes that journalists in Paris had described with some unease as utterly still. A reporter had asked him just before the flight how he felt about returning home after 15 years in exile. He had thought about it for a moment. Nothing, he said. That answer would echo through history. His name was Ayatollah Khomeini. And what happened in the 10 days that followed his landing would divide the modern world into a before and an after. A rupture so complete that the shockwaves are still moving through us today. But to understand those 10 days, you have to understand what had been building for a century. A nation and its wound. Iran has a word for it, Gharb-Zadagi. It translates roughly as West oxification, the idea that Western culture is not merely a foreign influence, but a disease, a contamination, a slow erasure of something irreplaceable. By the 1970s, millions of Iranians felt they were living inside that disease. On the surface, Iran looked like a success story. Oil money had modernized Tehran in a single generation. Highways where there had been dust roads. Universities where there had been seminaries. Women in miniskirts walking through the bazaar. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had declared it a revolution. He called it the White Revolution, a top-down transformation that would drag Iran into the modern world by force if necessary. But modernization paid for by oil money has a way of outrunning people. The factories didn't employ enough of them. The wealth pooled at the top. 1 million people had moved into Tehran from the countryside in a single decade, looking for the prosperity they'd been promised, and found themselves in crowded, forgotten neighborhoods on the edge of a glittering city they couldn't afford to enter. They could see the palace from where they lived. That is a specific kind of suffering. And underneath all of it, underneath the highways and the universities, and the Shah's photographs in every government building, was a wound that wouldn't heal. In 1953, Iran's elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh, had done something audacious. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, meaning he took Iran's oil back from Britain and gave it to Iranians. The British were furious. They convinced the Americans this was communism. The CIA organized a coup. Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country, was restored to his throne by a foreign intelligence operation. Every Iranian knew this story. They told it to their children. It became the founding myth of a humiliation. The Shah was not merely a king. He was, in the national memory, a puppet. His throne was made in America. You cannot build a nation on a wound that deep. You can only paper over it. Until the paper tears. The man who spoke from cassette tapes. Khomeini had been building his revolution from exile. First from Najaf, in Iraq. Then when Saddam Hussein expelled him in 1978 from a small house in the Paris suburb of Neauphle-le-Château, perhaps the most unlikely headquarters for a revolution in history. He sat cross-legged on the floor under an apple tree, giving interviews and issuing pronouncements that were recorded onto cassette tapes smuggled into Iran, copied by hand in basements and back rooms, and distributed through mosque networks across the country. No television station, no newspaper, no army. Just cassette tapes and the infrastructure of faith. And it worked, because Khomeini was saying something that cut through all ideological lines. He wasn't just speaking to the devout, he was speaking to the humiliated. He had a way of framing everything, every grievance, every injustice, every moment of foreign interference as part of the same story. The story of a proud civilization brought low by outsiders and the faithful people who were going to take it back. The communists heard resistance to imperialism. The intellectuals heard opposition to autocracy. The merchants heard an end to corruption. The poor heard justice. The devout heard God. He was all things to all people. That is what made him extraordinary, and it is what made what came after so disorienting. The cycle of blood. In January 1978, something small became something enormous. A government newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini. The students in the holy city of Qom took to the streets in protest. Government forces opened fire. Several were killed. In Shia Islam, the dead are mourned 40 days after their death. So 40 days later, there were more protests and more deaths. And 40 days after that, more protests again. The revolution moved on a liturgical calendar. Every massacre created its own momentum. The state was feeding the fire it was trying to put out. By September 1978, in an event that became known as Black Friday, soldiers opened fire on a crowd of protesters in Tehran's Jaleh Square. The official count was low. Witnesses said the bodies were carried away through the night. No one agreed on the number, but everyone agreed on what it meant. The Shah had shown his face. This was not a king who would compromise. This was a king who would shoot. The effect was the opposite of what the regime intended. The protests grew larger. The oil workers went on strike. By the end of 1978, Iran's oil production, the lifeblood of the economy, the source of the Shah's power, had collapsed by 80%. Workers at the state radio station cut the electricity at the precise moment the Shah's televised address was scheduled to begin. This was not just protest. This was humiliation. The Shah was, by this point, a dying man. He had cancer, though almost no one outside his inner circle knew it. He was being treated with drugs that affected his judgment. He vacillated. He apologized, but then cracked down. He appointed a new prime minister and then undermined him. He watched from a helicopter as millions marched through Tehran demanding his removal. On January 16, 1979, he boarded a plane. He told his prime minister as he left, "I give Iran into your care, yours and God's." He never came back. When the news reached the streets, Iranians tore down every image of him they could find. Strangers embraced in the road. People who had been afraid for years laughed until they cried. Soldiers handed flowers to protesters. It felt in that moment like the beginning of something clean. No one yet understood what it was actually the beginning of. 10 days February 1st, 1979. The plane circles Mehrabad Airport once before landing, to make sure reportedly that no tanks are blocking the runway. Then it descends. The door opens. Khomeini appears at the top of the stairs. The roar from the crowd is described by every journalist present as something they had never heard before and would never hear again. He could not leave the airport by car. The crowd was too dense, too overjoyed, too overwhelming. He had to be lifted out by helicopter. He flew directly to Behesht-e-Zahra, the cemetery where the revolution's dead were buried. He stood among the graves and gave a speech. His tone was not triumphant. It was cold and declarative. "I will appoint the government," he said. "I will slap this government in the mouth." Bakhtiar, the Shah's appointed prime minister, the man who had dissolved the secret police and freed political prisoners and done everything right, had exactly 9 days left in power. The 10 days that followed moved with the logic of a dream where everything is inevitable. Officers from the Iranian Air Force visited Khomeini's headquarters and pledged their loyalty. Revolutionary committees took over police stations. Soldiers laid down their weapons. On February 11th, the military high command made an announcement that, in its quiet, bureaucratic language, ended 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. They declared themselves neutral. Bakhtiar resigned, went into hiding, eventually fled to Paris, the same city Khomeini had just returned from. The wheel had turned completely. Iran was now something it had never been before, and something the world had never seen before. Not a communist state, not a liberal democracy, not a military dictatorship. Something new and strange and, to many, terrifying. A theocratic republic, governed by the principle that God's law and political law are the same law, administered by those who understand it best. The revolution eats itself. Here is what the millions in the street did not know on that February morning. They had not all been fighting for the same thing. The leftists had fought for workers' rights. The nationalists had fought for sovereignty. The women who had marched in their hundreds of thousands had fought for dignity. The intellectuals had fought for free expression. Many of them assumed Khomeini would be a symbolic figurehead, a spiritual presence, and that real governance would be handled by a coalition of the forces that had united to bring down the Shah. Khomeini understood this assumption. He let people believe it. Until he didn't need to anymore. Within months, the revolution began to turn on the people who had made it. Leftists were arrested. Newspapers were shut down. On March 8, 1979, International Women's Day, women who marched to protest the new compulsory hijab law were met with violence. The women who had been photographed stuffing flowers into rifle barrels now found themselves targets of a different kind of state. An American journalist asked Khomeini about the hijab requirement. He replied that women who didn't wish to cover their hair didn't have to work in government offices. That was the answer. One by one, the coalition that had made the revolution was dismantled. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was established. A new constitution was drafted, one that enshrined a concept Khomeini had been developing for years: Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, the idea that ultimate authority in all matters belongs to the supreme religious scholar. In December 1979, the constitution was approved. Khomeini became supreme leader. He had replaced one absolute ruler with another. Only this one spoke in the name of God. What changed? In November 1979, a group of students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 diplomats hostage. They held them for 444 days. Yes, the United States and Iran which had been the closest of allies, were now something else entirely. Something they have remained in varying degrees of hostility ever since. The revolution sent oil prices surging across the world. It inspired Islamist movements from Egypt to Indonesia. It terrified the Arab monarchies of the Gulf. It drew the United States deeper into the region's politics than it had ever been. It convinced Saddam Hussein that Iran, in its chaos, was vulnerable. And in 1980, he invaded, starting an 8-year war that killed perhaps 1 million people. And within Iran, it transformed a society in ways that are still being negotiated, still being fought over, on the streets and in the courts and in the hearts of Iranians who have known nothing else. The women who marched in 1979 had daughters. Those daughters had daughters. And those daughters have stood on the rooftops of Tehran on winter nights, chanting into the darkness, refusing to disappear. Here is what I keep returning to. A journalist on that Air France flight, watching Khomeini prepare to land in Tehran after 15 years away, asked him one more time what he was feeling. Khomeini looked at him with those still, unreadable eyes. Nothing, he had said. 5 million people were waiting for him below. Maybe he meant it as a mystic would, emptied of ego, an instrument of something larger. Maybe he was just cold. Maybe, after everything, he simply didn't experience anticipation the way other people did. Or maybe, and this is the thought I can't let go of, maybe he already knew exactly how this would end. And the knowledge of it made him feel nothing at all. The revolution did not arrive like a thunderstorm. It arrived like a tide, quietly at first, then all at once, then impossible to stop. And when it was over, the shore looked nothing like it had before. That is what revolutions do. They promise you the world, and they give you a different one.